back to another illuminating episode of Pleasure Principles, where we explore the transformative power of joy, intimacy, and the desire across every dimensions of life. I'm your host Avik, and today we are diving into a realm that often gets dismissed as just imagination. But what if fantasy is actually the gateway to healing, love, and conscious creation? Yes. So joining me today is the luminous Violet Lang. So welcome to the show, Violet.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Amazing, amazing. So, dear listeners, before we start, I'll quickly love to introduce you with Violet. Uh, dear listeners, Violet is a Harvard grad, spiritual coach, Reiki Master, and your go-to cosmic matchmaker. So, Violet has guided hundreds of women from heartbreak to healthy relationships using an intoxicating blend of embodiment, energy, and actionable wisdom. And yes, she even met her partner in a dream before they met in real life. Yes, dear listeners. And so it's really be a great conversation today, dear listeners. And so grab a cozy seat, or I mean, take us on your next walk, where we are about to discover like how fantasy isn't a kind of escape from the reality, but it's a way to rewire it. So I'll not take much of your time, dear listeners. Let's get into it. Welcome to the show again, Violet.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm excited
Yeah.
to talk about this really rich topic. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people think that fantasy, to your point, is just imagination and something that maybe they even should feel ashamed about. And for many people, fantasy lives in the intersection between shadow and sexuality. But when we bring consciousness to our desires, even if they're just desires in our mind, then we're able to receive the gift of healing and the gift of growth that our subconscious is trying to give us.
Hmm. True. Exactly true. So like to start with, I mean, with this truth bomb, like you have said before that fantasy is a portal, not an escape. So how did you come to this realization in your own healing journey?
For most of my life, I pushed away a lot of my desire. I grew up in a very conservative household, and I was in a marriage in my 20s that unfortunately led to divorce that was a sexless marriage. So there wasn't
Mm.
really much intimacy, I think maybe just a few times very early on. And as that relationship dissolved and we went in different ways, I realized I had a lot to learn about my body, about my desires, about intimacy, and about relationship. And as I started reconnecting to my body, I realized it wasn't just mechanical. I think a lot of times, at least in Western culture, there's an emphasis on what you wear or toys or, um,
Okay.
can your partner give you pleasure or
Mm.
um, almost pleasure as being something we have to just get it over with until we have like a partner who can meet all our needs. And
Mm.
I think that's a disservice to the unique individuals we each are that we um, can bridge our mind, our body, and our heart and use these powerful aspects of ourselves um, not only to better understand our sexuality, but actually to kind of direct our lives. And I can tell you maybe a story about that at some point.
Sure. Understood. Got it. Yeah. And what you said is really, really very true. And so I'll definitely get into it. But just wanted to ask, like, was there a moment like where a fantasy or maybe a vision became so real that it shifted your actual choices or the relationship?
Yeah, well, I think there's many points where my
Mm.
desire um, in my mind manifested in my life. To your point
Okay.
in the introduction, I had a dream about my husband that he came up to me in my dream and put his hand on my heart and like gave me a big smile. And I just thought, okay, universe, that's
Okay.
a nice vision. And then 3 weeks later, I met him at an event, and the focus of the event was lucid dreaming. So at a lucid dreaming event, he came up to talk to me, and I told the woman I was standing next to, "Oh my goodness, I had a dream about that guy." And she was like, "Wow." I think it was maybe one of the only contexts by which people didn't think I was crazy because it was an event about dreaming. And when I told him, I had a dream about you, I didn't tell him that on the first night because I thought maybe it would be a little bit
Mm.
scary or weird. But I told him at the end of our first date, and he loved it. He said, "Wow, I was, pursuing you even before I met you." So we had maybe
Mm.
similar values in terms of valuing the super
Yep.
conscious.
Exactly. Exactly. I understood. Yeah. So, like, yeah, definitely. I mean, I find this fascinating because often we are told to stay grounded, but sometimes grounding keeps us stuck in what's familiar. So, uh, like, listeners, like, what if what feels like make believe is actually your inner compass? So, what do you think, Violet, on this?
I completely agree. I have found that for myself and for my clients. I'll give another just brief story. There was a time where I was really into the Knights of the Holy Grail and like Merlin and dragons and all of these things. And I know I sound like a child, but it was actually just maybe 3 years ago or so. And I kept pushing it away, like not really thinking about it too much or thinking, well, that's silly. And then at some point, I just allowed myself to really feel the devotion of the knights, like what it would feel like to feel honored. Because the energy was not so much about um, medieval times, it was about, wow, the knights to me represented feeling honored. And so I brought that desire for honor and I brought that maybe fantasy of like knights of the Holy Grail into my connection with my pleasure. And then, funnily enough, once we actually allow ourselves to feel the fantasy, oftentimes it kinda dissolves, like, it doesn't have such a grip on us because we haven't shamed ourselves for it. So, that was only really alive for me, like, maybe a day after I allowed myself to have that fantasy. But what happened is my husband actually started really being even more complimentary to me, and I was taking a trip for a spiritual pilgrimage to Glastonbury in the UK, and we had some issues with fertility struggles, and one of our treatments we decided not to pursue or continue, and so we got some of the money we had paid back to us, and basically he said, "I want us to use that money to just pay for your trip." So, within just a few weeks, I went from wanting honor and desiring feeling honored by the masculine to actually being honored by the masculine and actually getting my full retreat paid for because to the place, Glastonbury is like kind of the place of the Knights of the Grail anyway, so it was just a really full circle experience in just a few short weeks.
Okay. Understood. Thanks for sharing this. And so I'll quickly love to understand, like in your coaching work, how do you help women tap into fantasy without feeling shame, guilt, and or maybe the fear of like wanting too much?
That's a great question. First, I like to normalize fantasy just like we're doing on this show. It's so great that you have
Mm.
this podcast. Second, I like to help them understand what's underneath the fantasy. So if they share with me their fantasy, let's say it's to have a sensual experience in the outdoors. I'm like, okay, well, it's pretty obvious that your psyche is craving more
Yeah.
time in nature, or perhaps that you're craving more connection to the
Mm.
wild part of you, the part that's not, sitting in front of a computer every day. And so I might encourage this woman to not only, enjoy her sensual fantasies when she's connecting with her own body, but I might invite her to actually take more hikes outside, or, I might create a movement practice for her of a
Mm.
tiger and say, act like the tiger for 3 minutes a day, and that
Yeah.
may unlock something in her.
Understood. Okay. So, and how do you differentiate between a fantasy that liberates us and one that reinforces the old wounds?
Thank you so much for asking that because many people are afraid to even dive into fantasy because they're afraid that they will be recreating something they don't want. And, sometimes oftentimes we have a fantasy about something we don't actually want to happen in real life. Like, I don't actually ever want to be with anyone that's not my husband. Like that's not something I ever want, but I can still allow my psyche to create healing with these, visions and scenes. And I think if we're re-traumatizing ourselves, we will notice more rigidity in our body, more fear in our mind. We'll feel a lot of shame. And sometimes we do feel shame with fantasy, but when we allow ourselves to enjoy it, that shame dissipates. But we know that we're reenacting it, I think, if our bodies and our body mind is getting more constrained and in a pain place versus in a pleasure place. Um, Also, I think if we're not allowing the healing movement in our day-to-day life, like, let's say we just have the fantasy, we feel ashamed about it, so we do it and we don't tell anyone and we feel guilty and we keep doing it again and again because we're almost addicted to that cycle of shame. That's one thing. But if we bring consciousness to it and we understand, well, what's the healing that I'm seeking underneath this fantasy? And we incorporate that, and maybe we also light a candle or say a prayer or we do something to offer up that request for healing to the universe, and then we start noticing, "Oh, this is different in my life," or like my story, I'm getting more honor from my husband, or I'm receiving in a different way, and then we're free to have a new fantasy that's taking us on a new kind of journey in our
Mm.
life.
Okay. Wow, amazing. And and like, I mean, it's really powerful. Like, it reminds me that sometimes what we crave is not the unrealistic. I mean, it's just not normalized yet. So fantasies where we reclaim that space. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing this. And uh so, about embodiment, how does the body play a role in anchoring the fantasy um, into reality? What do you say on this?
That's a great question. I think the body is important because the body is our physical vehicle, at least in this lifetime. And if we're just having the fantasy in our head, then we might end up in a mental loop and we might get stuck between craving and aversion. And if we're just going back and forth between craving and aversion and not finding that middle path of translating it into our body and into our life, then we're missing out on a big opportunity. And so I think a lot of women and a lot of people in general get a little stuck in our heads when it relates to relationships or sensuality. It might be hard to turn off our mind after a busy day or, stress in our family or with our health. But if we're not connected to our body and not able to kind of bring our bring our fantasies to life through our body,
Yeah.
then, it's like we're trapping energy or the energy gets kind of stagnant and doesn't have a release, and, obviously, pleasure is one form of release, and, there's been lots of studies about the power of pleasure on immunity and mental health and, releasing tension in the body, so we do need to understand our physical body and how to feel good in our physical body, and it doesn't mean that you don't have to sexualize every fantasy, but
Yes.
allowing yourself to feel pleasure in your body, even if it's just, yeah, like touching your own shoulder or your own arm or in my example of honor, like holding my arms as if I was giving myself a hug or sitting in a chair and imagining someone was down on their knees, like looking up at me with such admiration, like honor through their eyes. There's a lot of different places you can go with it. But another example is um, my husband and I had an experience a few weeks ago where I'm normally in a more kind of passive and receptive state. But as a gift to him, I gave him a massage and I was kind of what we called a
Mm.
devotional dom. So instead of a dominatrix that's like
Yeah.
punishing or shaming him, I was actually, I made him tea, I gave him a massage, I gave him like a cool rag on his forehead. Um, I told him nice things about him and I just said, you just need to sit in the chair and I will do the rest. And I just showered my devotion on him. And he was like, wow, that was such a gift because I've really only thought of agentic, directive, kind of forward energy as more masculine, and it was really beautiful to feel you and your feminine energy, but in a very kind of agentic way and this, yeah, devotional dom. So, um, I wouldn't have been able to do that had I not felt connected to my head, my heart, and my body. And that's an example of a fantasy that I had that I did do in real life because it was just this desire to be in love and loving service for my husband.
Exactly. That's the amazing part of it. Thank you so much for sharing this. There is a lot of things to learn from here, dear listeners. And also, if you can share, like, what are some of the simple embodiment practices our listeners can try to turn a kind of juicy vision into a kind of felt experience?
Yes, I think some of the simplest things are to just place a hand on one hand on your heart and one hand on your second chakra or your lower, you
Mm.
could say just your lower belly. So one hand on your heart, one hand on your lower belly, and just notice your breath. Just take a few deep breaths so that your hands are kind of moving as you breathe and as the inhale expands the body. And you can sigh when you exhale.
Mhm.
And then once you get into that place of connection to the body, connection to the breath, then just think of your fantasy and notice, am I constricting? Do I still feel some shame? Maybe I can kind of shake my body a little bit and shake that off, or have a louder exhale to let that go. And then once you've released some of the fear and shame, like, oh, can I feel the pleasure and the desire? And what is that's behind this fantasy, the emotional context once you strip away the shame.
Wow, amazing. So I really love that. I mean, our bodies don't lie, but they also don't move until they feel safe. So,
Mhm.
listeners, like, yeah. So, listeners, like, if you are nervous, or I'm sorry, like your nervous system, if your nervous system says that not yet, so it doesn't means never. Maybe it's not that time, but it doesn't means never. So, am I correct, Violet?
Absolutely. Yeah, there are plenty of times where I might have a fantasy or something that's been in my mind, and I try to connect with my body, and my body's like, no, thank you. I don't feel interested in that right now. And then I just let it go, then I just say, okay. And I might just turn it into a short meditation practice, or I might just breathe, like I was mentioning earlier. Or I might ask my mind, like, or my body, like, what do you need in order to feel safe? And maybe it wants me to journal about my fantasy first in order to get more clarity on what it is I'm really longing for underneath the fantasy. Maybe it wants me to tell my partner about the fantasy so I feel like I'm being loyal and inclusive with him. Maybe my body's just tired and it's like, I don't have the energy for this right now, even though pleasure is normally very energizing. So I completely agree. We have to honor the body's cues, slow down enough to trust the body and not kind of
Mm.
force an agenda because sometimes people do use pleasure almost as a way to regulate their nervous system. I see this a lot in couples where the man has a stressful job or maybe is in the military or something and he sometimes is using a sexual encounter to kind of discharge energy from his nervous system and I think a lot of women use use self-pleasure in that way of like, "Oh, I just need a release," and that's okay, I don't mean to judge that 'cause, everything is still beautiful, but I think our nervous systems, there's a lot of other ways that we can also get release. So to your point, we feel safe, and then once we feel safe, we can have maybe, more expansive experiences of pleasure that integrate our head, our heart, and our body.
True. Lovely. Lovely. So, okay, and like, so you're a spiritual teacher, and from there, what do you have to share with the listeners today? What do you want to share?
I believe that everything is energy and we're only in these bodies for a short time. And sometimes what we come into our lifetime with a fantasy of that may be taboo or we might think is a kink, could also be related to a past lifetime, or it could be related to a previous trauma. And so to be really gentle with ourselves, to really feel the gift of having a human body and a gift of sexuality. And
Mm,
even if you are in a religious context that doesn't celebrate sexuality in certain ways, um, it's still okay to connect to your body in a sensual but not a sexual way. You can still carve out your own unique relationship with your body and your spirit. And sometimes I've found that when we follow spiritual tools that have nothing to do with sexuality, it actually liberates some energy so that when we go back to doing embodiment work, we're coming from a place of more wholeness. And conversely, sometimes if we're feeling a bit, I don't know, at a plateau in our spiritual life, doing something related to our body or sexuality can amplify our spirituality. So I think it's much more of a dance between our spirit and our body than maybe we have put put awareness into, at least in the Western world. I think in Vedic times they were totally on board with all of this stuff, and they were a lot more advanced than we are in many ways as it relates to harnessing, um, our body and our chakras and our breath and our desires.
yes, exactly true. Wow, lovely. Great, Violet. I mean, this really has been nothing sort of soul stirring, and you have shown us how fantasy can be a sacred mirror and a strategy, and even a spiritual GPS, I would say. So, thank you so much for sharing this. And for everyone who is listening, or maybe you will be listening, if you have ever dismissed your daydreams, like ignored your desires or minimized your magic, then this is your reminder that fantasy is not fluff, it's frequency. And when we dare to tune in, we start creating um, from a place of wholeness and not survival. So, Violet, if someone wants to connect with you, want to have a discussion about the same, how they can connect?
They can go to my website. It's just violetlange.com, VIOLETLANGE.com. I have various programs, but it's sometimes easier to just send me an email or use my contact part of that page, of that site,
Mm,
because then I can customize what might be the right offering. For instance, my husband and I have a program called Evolutionary Couples, which is about keeping the passion alive in a relationship as a couple and as individuals. I also am working on a workshop for devotional dom, that kind of agentic feminine energy. And then I also have a course called Sacred Sensuality, which is about learning to flow pleasure through all of the seven chakras and how to merge your sexuality and your spirituality. So yeah, email me because it'll be easier for me to kind of customize what might be right for the listener.
Perfect. That's lovely. Awesome. So, dear listeners, if you have loved this conversation, go follow Violet Lang and see the beauty she's creating in the world. And I'll put all the links into the show notes for easy reference, dear listeners. And with this hope, until next time, this is your host, Avik, reminding you to trust your fantasies. They may be more real than you think. So, stay radiant, stay bold, and as always, follow your pleasure, find your power. Thank you so much.